Some people say the Jets trading for Aaron Rodgers will mortgage their future. That's not really true, but it will cost them some degree of financial flexibility going forward. I'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, March 29th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. You can subscribe or follow Locked On Jets for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it's available. Today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag full of listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in their questions this week. And let's begin with a question about Aaron Rodgers. Who else would we talk about? Our first question, one of the constant talking points with the Aaron Rodgers situation is the sacrifice of long-term financial flexibility. Essentially, the Jets would be mortgaging their future by bringing in Rodgers and his contract. This does not make sense to me. If it's because of the restructuring of contracts to fit in Aaron Rodgers, could the Jets not just soften the blow by having the Packers eat some of the money? If he retires next year, that money is off the books. So how does adding him mortgage the future exactly? How much damage would it do in future years? So one thing I want to say is that I think you have to be very careful with using phrases like mortgage the future, because I don't think that trading for Aaron Rodgers will mortgage the future. And I think when you're talking about mortgaging the future, I think you're talking about legitimately ending any chance the Jets have to compete. And something like that would mean that they would not have the money to re-sign Sauce Gardner or re-sign Garrett Wilson. That's not true. And that's not going to happen because the Jets get Aaron Rodgers. So I think that it's very easy to go to extremes in something like this and say that there's no long-term implications by trading for Rodgers. It's just as extreme to say that the Jets will be mortgaging their future. They will not be mortgaging their future. So I want to put that to rest right now. It will create obstacles, however. So let's talk about the structure of Rodgers' contract. It's kind of an interesting structure because most of the money he's going to make in 2023 is in the form of a bonus that the Jets presumably will pick up after they trade for him. And the way a bonus is paid in the cap is essentially you get the player gets all the money up front, or at some point in the near future he gets 100% of the money, but the cap hits are spread out equally over the life of the deal. So with Rodgers, he's got his bonus payment. His bonus is around $60 million. That's $60 million. There are 4 years left on his contract. So Rodgers gets $60 million for playing in 2023. But the cap hit this year is only around $15 million. But that also adds a $15 million cap hit to 2024. It adds a $15 million cap hit to 25, and it adds a $15 million cap hit to 26. And that's on top of what he's going to make in those years. So that doesn't mean his cap number is $15 million the next 3 years. That means you add $15 million over onto whatever he's making in those years. So when we talk about moving forward, I think the question mentioned that if Rodgers retires, that his contract disappears. That's not true. That money does not disappear. The Jets paid Aaron Rodgers $60 million. Every penny of that $60 million eventually needs to be charged to them against the cap. And, I've talked in recent weeks and months about some of my reservations. A lot of that deals with Rodgers retiring because a lot of that money comes due if Rodgers retires. Now, there are a couple different ways this could play out. I mean, there's a scenario where they could actually be charged the entire $45 million next year if Rodgers retires after this year. More likely, they would probably work it out to split it over the next 2 seasons, but that's not an insubstantial amount of money. If you're talking about back-to-back years where a guy counts $22 million, $22.5 million or so against your cap, and he's not on your team, that does impact your team's chances to compete. I mean, that's a very large percentage of your cap going to a player who's no longer on your team, who's not helping you in the least. And this is also at the point where some of your young core is about to enter their prime. So would this Jets be, would this mortgage the future? Well, not in the sense that, the Jets would be precluded from competing, but you can't take, $20 million off your cap. You're playing at a disadvantage against every other team in the league. You're essentially starting with $20 million less to work with for 2 straight years. They're 22 and a half, I guess. But that's a lot of money to be working at a disadvantage. It's an obstacle. Can you overcome it? Yes, that's why it's not mortgaging the future. But we can't sit here and act like that's nothing. And I do think another point that was made was that the fact that the Jets, in order to fit Rodgers and to fit some of these other guys into their cap situation, they're pushing a lot of guaranteed money to the future where they'll have to pay players for past performance. So this also is going to impact the Jets. Now, are they going to lose a superstar like Sauce Gardner? No. Are they going to lose a core player like Garrett Wilson? No. I'm a little hesitant to give running back second contracts, so I'll leave Breece Hall out of this for a moment, but is it going to prevent the Jets from giving Elijah Vera Tucker a second contract? No. Where it could impact them is, maybe in free agency. Maybe the next DJ Reed who's out there. Maybe they won't be able to afford him. It could come down, a good player like that. It could come down to the Jets versus some other team, and maybe the Jets just lose out by $1 million or $2 million because they've got all this dead money on the books for Rodgers. So that's where it comes in. It's not like, and I think maybe this is not a good podcast topic because I think people want to hear one or the other. Want to hear will have no impact on the Jets, or they want to hear we are doomed financially. And the truth is neither is the reality of the situation. But it's going to impact the Jets. It will be. I would term it an obstacle going forward. And I've made the argument, and I've lost, that for the Jets' Super Bowl odds with Rodgers, I'm not sure it's an obstacle I necessarily think is worth creating, but I've lost that battle, so Rodgers will be here. It's just something the Jets will have to deal with, and you hope you get a great 2023 season out of him, if nothing else, and maybe even get a 2024 season out of Aaron Rodgers. All right, our next question deals with whether more than just Rodgers could be coming to the Jets. What are the odds the Jets and Packers also work out a swap of tackles in the Rodgers trade, bringing the Jets David Bakhtiari? A few years ago, there was this mailbag question, and it was really interesting because I was asked which player who's a non-quarterback on another team, if I could take any non-quarterback in the NFL and add him to the Jets, who would I take? And I answered David Bakhtiari because he was a great left tackle, phenomenal left tackle for a number of years. And it was people were shocked, but that's what I in some ways I try and be very new school. Like I really do enjoy analytics. I enjoy a lot of the new types of strategy that are entering the NFL. What the numbers telling you, going for it on fourth down, lots of different things. Being aggressive on 2-point conversions. These are things that I really like. But in some ways, I'm kind of old school, where after my quarterback, the second guy I want is the left tackle. What are the odds the Jets get Bakhtiari? That was the actual question. A few weeks ago, I would have told you I thought pretty good because Rodgers, we've seen it. He's already brought Alan Lazard to the Jets. There are probably some other guys who are going to follow who are friends of his. And Bakhtiari is personal left tackle. That would have been a logical fit, especially given the Jets' offensive line issues. But Bakhtiari redid his deal with Green Bay. And, first of all, I don't think the Packers would have done that if they had any intention of trading him. But when you redo somebody's deal, typically it makes them much tougher to trade. So I think the odds are actually quite low that the Jets will get Bakhtiari at this point. I would have answered differently a few weeks ago, but I don't think he's, I think there will be a lot of, friends of Aaron Rodgers, so to speak, coming to the Jets, but I don't think David Bakhtiari will be one of them. Listen, I'd still welcome him. I still think he would be a pretty logical fit for the Jets, but I think that ship has sailed. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, believe it or not, we're going to talk more Aaron Rodgers. We're going to talk about how much of his salary Green Bay should take on to make it a good deal for the Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. We're talking Aaron Rodgers. It's Jets offseason. The draft is just a few weeks away. There are no games to watch, though. That's not true of college basketball, however. The tournament's heating up. In fact, it's not just heating up. We have the Final Four this weekend with 3 first-time participants in the Final Four. And there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon and sign up today to claim your no-sweat first bet. Then you can wager on everything from the money line to point spreads to which team will be cutting down the nets, and it's all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your shot at a no-sweat first bet. Bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. We continue with our weekly mailback. Our next question. John, let's assume the Jets trade 2 second-round picks for Rodgers. What percentage of Rodgers' salary should be kept by the Packers? At what point would the Packers be eating enough salary to make this trade a good one for the Jets? It strikes me that if the Packers take on a large proportion of the salary, the Jets will not be stuck with a bad contract, and they'll maintain cap flexibility. That means Rodgers would be worth a bigger price. I don't love the idea of giving up 2 second-round picks for Rodgers no matter what, because that's an awfully high price for any sort of rental player. So I hope the price is lower. But in all honesty, I think my bigger issue is the contract, because it's just a bad contract. I mean, it's not an accident Green Bay's trying to get out of this thing. They made a big mistake signing this contract a year ago. If the Jets are willing to give a lending hand to help Green Bay out of this contract, I mean, well, I still don't understand why the Jets have to give up much to get Rodgers, because this is a salary dump, essentially. I mean, Green Bay is trying to, I guess what it is for appearances, because I guess Green Bay's, very hesitant to think about how it will be perceived in their fan base and maybe across the league if they just give Rodgers up a first ballot Hall of Famer. But given the circumstances, that's, the Jets are taking on a bad contract. I mean, there's no other way to put it. So I think one of the things I would like to see is the Jets not take on the bad contract. Essentially, if the Jets are going to take Rodgers, then the Jets are going to actually give up an asset, and I hope it's not 2 second-round picks. But if the Jets are actually going to give up an asset, I'd like to see the Packers eat half the contract. Because Rodgers at $30 million for where he is, and I think, he's not the player he used to be. He's still probably going to play at a high level this year. But I think at $30 million, that becomes a good value for the Jets for a one-year quarterback. And that's the point where I think you can justify at least giving up one asset. I don't know about 2 assets. I don't know about 2 second-round picks. But for me, that's kind of the price. So the closer the Jets get to getting the Packers to pick up half the tab, the happier I am. The further away it is, the less happy I am. But I put it around $30 million because I think that's the point where Rodgers would become a good value even in a one-year scenario for the Jets. Our next question. The team has been saying Zach Wilson is going to be the number 2 quarterback this year, but do you believe that to be true? Or do you see them bringing in a veteran to back up Rodgers so Zach Wilson can just study and and learn without the threat of actually playing? If so, who do you see as viable options? And if not, does Streveler stay on the roster as number 3 or number 2? So lots of questions there. They say Zach Wilson's going to be the backup. I don't know if I believe them on that because for the reasons you mentioned. I mean, if we're talking about actually focusing on developing Zach Wilson, you don't want him on the field. I mean, look what happened this past year. They put him back on the field after they benched him, and it was bad. I think Zach Wilson's at the point where he's got to learn from the sideline. So, and beyond that, you're trying to win the Super Bowl this year. You can't be one injury away from Zach Wilson starting at quarterback. That just doesn't work. So I think they have to look for a veteran. I don't know that there are many great names out there, so, we'll see what happens on that front. But I don't think Streveler is much of an option. I mean, Streveler, maybe you can build a package for Streveler. It was kind of exciting when he was running around in that Jacksonville game, that Thursday nighter. But, I mean, I don't know that there's really a future for Streveler outside of maybe being like a sub-package player. Guy maybe you build a couple plays for, where you utilize his running skills, but outside of that, I don't see it. Next question, John. What do you think the Jets' plan is for Garrett Wilson, and do you think they value him as a true number 1 receiver? We have signed a solid group of role-playing receivers and may sign another in Odell Beckham Jr. With as many resources as the Jets have devoted to the position, do you think collectively this group was that bad, or do you think the hope is to ease some of the burden off Wilson, allowing him to become elite? Well, I think they've brought in some role players. I think they've brought in some depth players. I mean, that's what I think Alan Lazard is. That's what I think Mecole Hardman is. I don't know that they've done a great job helping Garrett Wilson out, though. And I do think they view him as a number 1 receiver. Look, a guy had 1,100 yards with the worst quarterback play in the league. You got to be a pretty good receiver to do that. And that's as a rookie. So, year 2, you're hoping to, it doesn't always go this way, but year 2, you're hoping to see him take the next step and maybe become one of the elite receivers in the NFL. But if we're talking about is Garrett Wilson the number one receiver, I guess, technically, and I don't love, the phrase number one receiver, but technically, if you think about it, being a number one receiver in its essence means you're one of the top 32 receivers in the NFL because there are 32 teams. Garrett Wilson's absolutely a top 32 receiver, and I mean, I think that if the Jets weren't confident in Garrett Wilson as a number one, they would have been more aggressive trying to bring in a bigger name, not bring in some of these depth players. I mean, for me, I don't love the idea. I got to be honest with you. I really don't love the idea of Odell Beckham Jr. because I really feel like it's a big risk, and you could definitely see a scenario where it goes sideways. But the problem is it doesn't seem like the Jets are that interested in DeAndre Hopkins. So if they're not interested in DeAndre Hopkins, they got to get in a guy who can take some of the pressure off Garrett. I don't think Lazard is that. I think Lazard's a role player. I think Lazard's a third or fourth option. Mecole Hardman's a fourth option on a good team. So from that sense, I mean, they got to find in a guy who could at least be a sidekick for him. And, Beckham, at least to an extent, was kind of that sidekick for Cooper Kupp when we last saw him playing with the LA Rams 2 years ago. So I look at this. I don't think they've done a great job surrounding Garrett with a good supporting cast. I would have liked to see them be more aggressive. In fact, what I wanted them to kind of look at as their model was what the Philadelphia Eagles did last year. Devontae Smith had a very good rookie, maybe not as good as Garrett, but Devontae Smith had a good rookie season in 2021. What did they do? They surrounded him with more talent. They went out and made an aggressive move for A.J. Brown. In fact, last offseason, I wanted the Jets to be aggressive and go get a veteran receiver. And, they really did not. I know they tried to get Tyreek Hill, but they were not as aggressive as I thought they should have been last year. And this year was a perfect spot because I feel like it's not necessarily getting one of those guys means that you doubt Garrett Wilson's the number one receiver. It's just good to have two number one receivers. Look at Cincinnati. It's Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. They're both number one receivers. So when you put a lot of stress on the defense, because even if a defense has and there aren't many Sauce Gardners, but even if a defense has a Sauce Gardner, if you got two of them, you can't put Sauce on both of them because not every team has a DJ Reed. So I think that, I would have liked to have seen the Jets be more aggressive at receiver. I think Beckham is probably the guy who comes. I think it's probably the best fit at the moment, but certainly comes with a degree of risk. I would have liked to see the Jets be more aggressive at the receiver position. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to close out the weekly mailbag. We're actually going to play a lightning round. Somebody sent in a question with looking for a bunch of quick answers, so we'll play lightning round ahead here on this Wednesday Locked On Jets mailbag. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on our Wednesday mailbag show. We're going to close out. Somebody sent in a question asking me for a bunch of quick thoughts. So it's phrased Jim Cramer lightning round question. So I have to choose between two options. And the first question is Ray Lucas or Glenn Foley. Now, I don't know if I can only answer in one word. I'm going to actually give some explanations here. Glenn Foley actually had some good games at the end of 97, had a really big game in the opener in 98 in San Francisco. That was the game Garrison Hurst ran for a 99-yard touchdown in overtime. But I think you got to go Ray Lucas. Ray Lucas took over for Rick Meyer in 1999. 99, Vinny Testaverde gets hurt at the beginning of the season. First game of the season. Rick Meyer takes over as the quarterback. Actually, Tom Tupa, technically the punter, took over as the quarterback for the first game until the fourth quarter. That's when Tupa threw 2 touchdowns against New England. But then Rick Meyer took over for Tupa, and the Jets got off to a terrible start that year. But Ray Lucas came in and led the Jets to an 8-8 finish, 8-8 record after everything seemed lost. It felt like the entire season had gone down the drain. And Ray Lucas kind of sparked them to a big finish. They fell just short of the playoffs, but Ray Lucas in 99 really brought the Jets back from the precipice. And I think if Bill Parcells was being honest with you, he would admit that his biggest mistake that year was not going to Lucas sooner. Next questions are Lamont Jordan or Sean Green. Green had that great moment, great stretch in the 09 playoffs. In fact, in the AFC Championship game against the Colts, him getting hurt early in the second half was maybe the turning point of that game. If he had not gotten hurt, because he was running the ball really well in the playoffs, that may have, and the Jets were a run-oriented team. That game may have turned out differently if Green had stayed in. But I have to go Lamont Jordan. Lamont Jordan was a number one back and who just had the misfortune of playing behind Curtis Martin. And he went to the Raiders and had a 1,000-yard season, so I got to go Lamont Jordan. Jason Ferguson or Snacks Harrison? Ferguson was a tremendous player. Jets really missed him after he left in free agency in 04, but Snacks Harrison was as dominant of a run-stopping nose tackle as you'll ever see. I mean, he's probably, maybe the best Jets run defender of his generation. So I'd go Snacks Harrison. Chancey Stuckey or David Clowney? Well, that one's easy. Chancey Stuckey. David Clowney was this guy who dominated preseason games, but never did anything during the regular season. So it's got to be Stuckey. Stuckey was a slot receiver. He wasn't great, but he had a few moments. He had a touchdown catch like almost every opening day he played in, and then he got traded to Cleveland in the Braylon Edwards trade. So Stuckey made plays in the regular season. He made plays in real games. David Clowney dominated the second half of preseason games. Aaron Glenn or Ray Mickens? Two great Jets corners, but Aaron Glenn. Aaron Glenn was made a bunch of Pro Bowl teams with the Jets. Mickens was never that good. Aaron Glenn, for a stretch, was one of the better corners in the NFL. Mickens was good. Mickens could play inside. He could play outside. Maybe a little undersized. Well, Glenn was undersized too, but Mickens had a little bit more versatility. But Aaron Glenn was a heck of a corner for the Jets, one of the greatest corners in Jets history. Pete Kendall or Alan Faneca? Now, these two are actually related. Pete Kendall signed with the Jets in training camp in 2004, played left guard for 3 years, helped stabilize the offensive line. In 2007, he asked for a $1 million raise, and Eric Mangini would not give it to him, and ended up trading him to Washington. The left tackle situation turned into a disaster with Adrian Clark, who to this day may be the worst offensive lineman I've ever seen in my life. If you don't think a left guard is capable of destroying an entire offense, you should have watched the 2007 Jets with Adrian Clark. It would have been, if Locked On Jets existed in 2007, he would have been one of the stars of the show that season because he was a disaster. He was maybe the worst offensive lineman I've ever seen play in the NFL. And because the Jets would not give Pete Kendall $1 million in 2007 and suffered this disaster, they ended up having to give Alan Faneca a huge... because of $1 million, they ended up having to give Alan Faneca this monster free agent deal in 2008. But I think Kendall was good. I got to go Faneca, though. Faneca was part of that dominant offensive line in 2009 that the Jets rode. He was excellent in his 2 seasons with the Jets. And then, just completely incomprehensibly, the Jets drafted Vladimir Dukas and then cut Kendall. Unfortunately, Matt Slauson was able to step into the starting lineup, but the Jets essentially drafted Dukas to take over for Faneca. And people will say, no, they didn't. Yes, they did. They literally cut Faneca like hours after they drafted Dukas. It was obvious they drafted Dukas to replace Faneca, and it did not work out at all. And that's the perfect segue. Vlad Dukas or Brian Winters, and that's the last one. What a way to end this show. Vladimir Dukas or Brian Winters. Well, the answer to that's pretty simple. In 2013, the Jets benched Dukas for Winters. So Winters was not great, but Winters, started for a number of years. Vlad Dukas was a second-round pick who started 4 games for the Jets. I was never a big Winters fan, but he was much better than Vlad Dukas. He was not a total disaster the way Dukas was out there. So Brian Winters. So that's the lightning round. Anyway, thank you for the questions. But that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.